from Pipers'Persuasion. Today, after it almost seems like a fortnight of travel, it's actually only 4.5 hours. I got here from sunny Kilmarnock to even sunnier Aboyne, and it's what date is it today? 19th of November, and it's 2013, and we're gradually closing to the end of another fruitful year for Pipers'Persuasion. Today we have a wee bit something different for you, because we have 3 people, and mainly we're going to be discussing pibroch in this area, their knowledge of pibroch, and particularly possibly the knowledge of the masters Nichol and Brown. So as usual, just sit back and enjoy. Right, gentlemen, good afternoon from Pipers'Persuasion, and thank you very much for agreeing to take part and giving me your time this afternoon. And I hope for the viewers it's a very welcome discussion, and that we're able to throw some light in this arcane subject of pibroch. Dr. Jack Taylor, thanks for your hospitality here this afternoon, and next to you we have Duncan Watson, and Duncan's left we have Norman Mathieson. Jack, I think we'll just kick on very quickly. Can you tell me your first introduction to the Great Highland bagpipe and how it developed?
Yeah, I was 11 and a piping teacher came to the school. I put my hand up and that was the start. The teacher was Bert Barron, and he was very inspirational for me as a teacher.
Well known in the area, of course, but Bert. Who else did Bert teach?
Bert taught a lot of pupils in Madras College and surrounding area over years. He taught at I think Strathallan School as well. He taught at one of the private schools. Yeah. He taught Bill Witherspoon, a great friend of mine, and both Bill and I were fortunate in winning the gold medal at Inverness, and that was in large part due to Bert's tuition.
Aye. And did you go into pibroch early, or was it much later in your...
He was always keen. I suppose I started pibroch when I was about 14.
Aye, okay. What was your first tune?
Glengarry's Lament.
Aye, okay, that's fine. Aye. And it developed from there, did it? And I understand you went to university, Aberdeen, is that correct?
Yep.
And you met Ian Duncan.
Yep.
Ian Duncan alluded to you in his interview, and did you go to Nichol and Brown?
Yeah, we did. Bob Nichol and Bob Brown too, I think they called us the 3 Musketeers.
Aye.
And we went often together to both Nichol and to Brown.
So that was you and Ian
and Bill Witherspoon.
The
3 of us went, and we fed off each other, and we were enthusiastic in these days.
How many tunes did you pick up from, many pibrochs did you pick up from these people?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I suppose you would go over the set tunes every year, and then other tunes you wanted to learn. I would say roughly 40 or 50 probably. Okay. In detail anyway.
Right, and we'll come back to that after this brief introduction. Duncan, what was your introduction to the bagpipe?
My father played the pipes. We stayed in Dingwall in Russia. He was brought up in Strathconnell, and he took a real interest. He was pretty well self-taught, but was very interested in the whole thing, and it was his influence that started me off. And I suppose really it was very, very informal, just copied off his fingers and so on. And then at the age of 13 or 14 years of age, I started going to a class that was being run in Coninbridge. It was originally run by Donald MacLeod, who was then taken over by John A. McClellan, and then when I went to it was a fellow William MacDonald, who was affectionately known as Wattery Willie.
Aye.
And I had a few winters with him, and that's what introduced me to pibroch in particular.
So it was really the latter person that gave you the pibroch. Or did you get some from Donald and John?
No, it was...
Just the light music?
Just, well, Donald MacLeod and Johnny MacLeod, they had kind of moved on, and Wattery Willie took over from him. Shouldn't be calling him Wattery Willie, but he was known as that.
Aye. Norman, what was, how were you introduced to the noble instrument?
Well, I was brought up in Glenlivet, but I came into school in Aberdeen to Gordon's College and joined the Army Cadet Force. I was a pipe band there, so at the age of 13, that's how I started in the pipe band. And then how I got to know Nichol was, as a teenager I used to play around some of the small games competing, see. And in 1951 I was playing at the Kennethment Games, and Nichol was also competing, and he came up to me afterwards. I'd never met him before, and asked if I would like to come to him for pibroch instruction. So that began a long association of almost 30 years.
My goodness. You must have impressed him then. You must have created an impression initially.
Well, I think I beat him that day.
I suppose that's as good an impression as any. What bagpipe were you playing at that time?
Laurie drones.
Was
at that time being Hardy chanting.
Yes.
They're beautiful drones, they really are quite exceptional.
Yes, So, and there'd be nice sounding then, eh?
Very much so.
Aye, okay.
Duncan was very envious of them.
Put behind them.
Still got them, Norman.
Oh yes.
And what pipes do you have yourself, Duncan?
Well, I never had a set of pipes of my own until I was 38 years of age. I used my father's pipes, and I used my brother's pipes.
Right.
And the pipes that my brother had, they were kind of a family thing. They were more or less given to the family. So really it wouldn't have been my brother. My brother's quite well known. His name is Hughie Watson from Dingle. He's a bit of a character, dare I say. And I actually had to buy the pipes off of him, you know.
Were they expensive?
Well, quite expensive at the time. He still holds it against me.
What? You didn't give him enough money?
But they were a set of Henderson drones enough. Bob Nichol used to go away and say, oh, I used to like the sound of them. Quite a heavy sound of them, quite difficult to read, but once you got them going, they were really quite an outstanding sound of them.
Jack, from Verasson but instruments, I might as well ask your good self, what instrument have you played over the years?
I started off with a lorry set, which Bert Barnes sold to me for £20. And they were just a plain mounted lorry set. I liked them a lot. I then had a neighbour who heard I piped. He had a set of thou, and he gave them to me in permanent loan, and they were a lovely ivory mounted set of thou bagpipes Dundee. And these are the ones I won my gold medal on. I then broke the top of the bass drone, as one does. Didn't manage to replace it, and so these pipes were refurbished by my teacher Bert to what I've got now, which is thou bottom joints, Henderson top joints, lorry silver. So they're a real Mongol set of pipes.
Duncan, I think you've got something to tell us about how you came to join the police and came from Dingwall.
Well, I was in the Territorial Army Pipe Band, and I was never very fond of pipe bands, to be perfectly honest, and maybe I shouldn't say this, I'm still not terribly fond of them, you know. And it was at that time John Stewart, the late John Stewart and Donald Morrison, they were doing a bit of recruiting round the games. And I was serving my apprenticeship as a turner and so on at home. And I was interested in the police. My uncle had been in the police in Inverness and so on. However, met Ian MacLeod, who was the pipe major of the Edinburgh Police at the time, and he said, oh, you fancy join the police, you're tall enough and maybe stupid enough to join the police, you know. So I don't think you need to be terribly clever to be in them anyway. So,
The right shape of feet as well.
that's right. So thought about this, and John Reach, who was a pipe major of the Seafood Highlanders at the time, he was a pupil of Donald MacLeod. I knew I was more interested in pibroch and so on, and he suggested, look, if you go to Aberdeen, you're within striking distance of two guys called, well, one Bob Brown, another Bob Nichol, who I'd heard of but had never really met. And on that basis, I came to Aberdeen City Police just to get to them.
It still afforded you time to continue your piping, and I take it you had nothing to do with the Grampian Police Pipe Band as such.
I was, well, Donald Morrison was a pipe major of the Aberdeen City Police for a while when I was there, and then John Stewart took over.
Tell me a wee bit about Donald Morrison, because he was famous in his own
He
right.
was, Donald was of course he was a long-time pupil of R.B. Nichol. He first met Bob Nichol in South Uist when Bob Nichol was teaching out there. And how Donald came here to Aberdeen and was of interest also. Bob Nichol took Donald Morrison to Percival Road in Inverness, where John MacDonald resided, because Donald had never met John MacDonald. By this time John MacDonald would have been more or less bedridden. And Donald went through to the bedroom and introduced to John MacDonald, and Bob Nichol left Donald with John MacDonald, and of course they were reminiscing about the different families in South Uist and so on. And eventually Donald Morrison started speaking of Nichol and Brown, and John MacDonald suggested he come to Aberdeen because that two men had it all. They were the best persons to go to. So at that time, I think Donald would have been serving in the Merchant Navy, and he finished that and came to Aberdeen City Police to really be able to be within striking distance of the two Bobs. That's what brought him here.
Yes.
He followed a chap, the pipe major before that was a fellow Neville Mackay, who was a New Zealander.
Right.
And he actually was in Inverness for a period of time prior to the death of John MacDonald Inverness, you know.
Okay. So you were there during that period, and did they do much competing, tell the people?
Donald Morrison did a good bit of competing, and so did John. I did a bit of it, but I was still very much in my infancy insofar as my police service concerned, and the pipe band we were afforded to go to functions and so on, but getting off the competitions was not really it wasn't very great for me. I recall, for example, going to the Northern Meeting, finishing 6 o'clock in the morning at night shift, driving up the road to Inverness and doing my bit, and being back night shift in Aberdeen
that night.
Donald Morrison, he didn't quite have to do that, and neither did John Stewart. Donald had an advantage. He was a native Gaelic speaker, and for a while with a chief constable from Lewis who was a native Gaelic speaker, and I think
That's a wee bit.
some kind of
we deal
going on there.
On Nichol and Brown, your introduction to them?
Well, the first time I met Bob Nichol was at a thing in Aberdeen, and played away to him. It was a thing it was a quartet pipe band thing, and introduced to him. I'd heard a lot about him. He was quite a legendary figure at home. There was names like R.U. Brown, Willie Ross, and people like that. And I remember, for example, Bob Brown came to the Dingwall Games one time, and I was with my father. Now Bob Brown at one time, he was working at Fairburn Estates. My father didn't know him, although he was acquainted to that area because Scotwell and North Strathconnell were all in the same claim. And my father pointed out this odd looking footwear that Bob Brown was wearing at the time. It was Hill shoes. and there was a great flap over the throat, and the shoes, there had a great bend in them. Where you could just imagine them climbing through hills and heather. That was the first time I saw Bob Brown. Bob Nichol, I met him, as I say, in Aberdeen, and he told me I was blowing pipes that were far too strong. Moving on quickly, my first real encounter with Bob Brown was at the Aboyne Games. And what happened there was, well, got off to an ignominious start, not so thought. At that time, the Aboyne pibroch required 6 tunes, 6 marches, 6 suspé, 6 reels and 6 pibroch. So I would go there, a bold young fellow, and the persons who were judging were Plonk MacDonald, whose proper name was Alec MacDonald, the Scots Guards guy, Old Angus MacPherson, and Bob Brown. So I presented my tunes, and Bob Brown was the man who said, oh, well, Patrick or McCrimmon. And I got all this from tape recordings and so on of Donald MacLeod and what have you. So I set off playing this. Well, I thought I was playing pretty good, and I think maybe as good as maybe what I hear a lot of folk are doing now.
Aye.
But I saw Bob Brown out the corner getting a bit uneasy, and we were behind a table, and every now and then I come round, Bob Brown would give a movement with his hand. And I thought, I wonder what's wrong with him. So I go round, and as I'm going round again, it was getting higher and higher. And I thought, I'm not going to let this get above the table. So as I go around, I thought, I'm going to go away in a well-measured fashion, break down, you know, because I'm not going to let this, I'm not going to let him get to that stage.
Aye.
So I had stopped. And he gave a nod and away I went. Later on he came to me and says, oh, he says, thank goodness you stopped. He says, there was a lot of good potential that you'll have to come up and see us.
Ah.
There's potential there, he says, but that tune deserves a bit better than what you were giving it.
Oh well.
So I thought to myself, oh, for goodness sake. I never took any offence to it, I was
No.
quite happy to be honest.
Aye.
So that was my first introduction to Bob Brown.
Aye. Aye. What, Norman, what was your memories of Nichol and Brown?
Well, I didn't know Bob Brown. I mean, I knew Bob Brown, but not at all well. Obviously, met him several times. But I knew Nichol very well. I mean, the man himself, not very tall, fairly bulky, florid face, and a glass eye, because he had lost his eye in a shooting accident in 1926. Reserved, not terribly happy or confident in company, you know, unless you know them. So he came across maybe to people who didn't know him as rather stern and remote, especially on the bench maybe, because you know he might close one eye, but his blooming glass eye was staring at you, see, and he was very reticent and so on. But of course, when you knew him, that was different altogether.
Aye.
He was he had a good sense of humour. He would characteristically throw his head back and burst out laughter at this, that, and the other. I got to know him very, very well because, I mean, apart from the regular Pipers'Persuasion sessions, we both had shared interests in fishing. You see, a lot of his time he spent as a gillie on the Dee. Salmon fishing and deer stalking we were both involved in, so we did a lot of other things to bind the relationships.
Excellent.
So I knew him very, very well, and from that time in 1951 until his death in 1978, I had the misfortune, I was a consultant surgeon and I had to operate on him when he had rather advanced bowel cancer that wasn't curable, so it was rather not very pleasant procedure, and to watch him dying thereafter over a period of time.
And a good friend too. Yes, quite distressing. What was his method of teaching?
Oh,
Was it active
singing,
or was it quite
singing,
passive? Or?
Singing. I mean, I don't think Bob would ever have used a chanter to impart anything. It was he would you know, you were tackling a new pibroch, he would sing it over, and you would go away and get it up and play it on the pipes. There's hardly any chanter work. I think the rest of you would agree with that. It was always sung over, and of course it had to be the way that John MacDonald taught it. I mean, nothing else was acceptable.
Any particular reason for that? Would you like to expand on that?
He believed that John MacDonald really was the master pibroch player of the day. And see, when they went to him, well, Nichol went first 1926. John would have been 58 or 9. But John MacDonald won 4 clasps in his 60s. And Bob Nichol used to say, well, you know, they heard him playing a lot of times. And he felt that what MacDonald played was quite exceptional. And Badjo, you had to stick to that, or it was no use.
Norman, what was your memories of Nichol and Brown?
Well, I didn't know Bob Brown. I mean, I knew Bob Brown, but not at all well. Obviously, met him several times, but I knew Nichol very well. I mean, the man himself, not very tall, fairly bulky, florid face, and a glass eye, because he had lost his eye in a shooting accident in 1926. Reserved, not terribly happy or confident in company, you know, unless you know them. So he came across, maybe to people who didn't know him, as rather stern and remote. Especially on the bench, maybe, because you know, he might close one eye, but this blooming glass eye was staring at you, you see, and he was very reticent and so on. But of course, when you knew him, that was different altogether. He was he had a good sense of humour. He would characteristically throw his head back and burst out laughter at this, that, and the other. I got to know him very, very well, because I mean, apart from the regular pibroch sessions, we both had shared interests in fishing. You see, a lot of his time he spent as a gillie on the Dee. Salmon fishing and deer stalking we were both involved in, so we did a lot of other things to bind the relationships.
Excellent.
So I knew him very, very well, and from that time in 1951 until his death in 1978, I had the misfortune, I was a consultant surgeon, and I had to operate on him when he had rather advanced bowel cancer that wasn't curable, so it was rather not very pleasant procedure, and to watch him dying thereafter over a period of time.
And a good friend too. Yes, quite distressing. What was his method of teaching?
Oh,
was it active
singing,
or was it quite passive? Or?
Singing. I mean, I don't think Bob would ever have used a chanter to impart anything. It was he would you know, you were tackling a new pibroch, he would sing it over, and you would go away and get it up and play it on the pipes. There's hardly any chanter work. I think the rest of you would agree with that. It was always sung over, and of course it had to be the way that John MacDonald taught it. I mean, nothing else was acceptable.
Any particular reason for that? Would you like to expand on that?
He believed that John MacDonald really was the master pibroch player of the day. And see, when they went to him, well, Nichol went first 1926. John would have been 58 or 9. But John MacDonald won 4 clasps in his 60s, and Bob Nichol used to say, well, you know, they heard him playing a lot of times, and he felt that what MacDonald played was quite exceptional and banjo. You had to stick to that, or it was no use.
Jack, I think I'll ask you here, where did John MacDonald get his knowledge from?
Well, John MacDonald, and Bob Nichol was always and frequently told you John MacDonald got his pibroch from Callum Piper. He also got it from the Camerons, so he had it from, quotes, both sources, because there was this division, so-called division between the styles, and so he had really had it. And of course these people had it, if you trace their lineage back via the Bruces and Glenelg to the McCrimmons. So this was coming from the original source, and he was always very, very keen to point that out.
Is there any chance that some of that could have been lost from the composer down the ages to MacDonald?
My own personal view is that it evolved and changed, and it probably continues to do so. Even in my own piping lifetime, the style of pibroch playing has changed, and I think that happens with any musical form.
Aye.
But I think the basic nuts and bolts of the thing, once it developed, has stayed pretty well the same.
Okay. So the basic groundwork was there, but minor nuances in the interpretation.
Nuances, interpretation, tempos,
Yeah.
I think they all probably change and continue to change, which is fine.
Your views on that, Norman? What is your views? You get any comment on
Well,
that?
it's inevitable. I mean, in an oral tradition, it's inevitable
Yeah.
that there will be changes
Aye.
and things will be lost inevitably. But I think somebody like Nichol, you see, I think he was very, very faithful to what he'd received from John MacDonald.
Yeah.
With these limitations, obviously, there must be some loss over
nothing,
time. You know,
no major deviation.
It's
This is
not written
what,
down in tablets of stone.
Aye.
But he was very, very rigid in a way that tunes must be played. And there's no other way, you know. It's got to be that. And it was a very minor little things, microseconds of this, that, and the other.
Aye.
Really precision. But you see,
was
it's
this
similar. If you
this
see any master musician taking a master class, be it in piano or whatever, there's this same obsessional attitude to the most minor things, you see. That's the way it was with Nichol.
Duncan?
Well, there's a conversation, I can't remember word for word what he said, but it was along the lines that he felt that, and this is going back, I would have been in my mid-20s, that he was really known about pibroch not being as pointed as it might be or it should be. And in the conversation I said, I wonder what like it'll be in maybe 40 years time. Oh, he says, as a young fella I said the same sort of thing to John MacDonald of Inverness. Now we're speaking
Yes.
80 years, and I don't suppose it has changed that terrible much. Although I think in our lifetime it has become a bit more bland.
I don't wish to insert my own opinion here. I'm asking a question. Is there a predominance of people now learning from a tape and book rather than going to personal?
I think that's definitely true, and really there's obviously pibroch and piping in general, it's based largely on competition, and there's a careful kind of attention paid to technique and so on, and that seems to be taking a bit off the pointing side of it. That's my impression of the thing anyway.
Norman, do you feel that the technique was good at that way back at that point? And
Sorry, the technique?
and with John MacDonald and Nichol.
Well, if you're talking about specifically about technique as opposed to interpretation, my impression, or can only be an impression, I think the technique has deteriorated significantly. There are quite a percentage of competitors around the games, at least the ones that I've been judging at, with poor technique, really poor technique.
Yeah.
And I think some judges seem not to take much account of it. That's my impression. I think technique has deteriorated.
Hey, you got a comment here, Jack?
I would think there would always have been pipers with excellent technique, and they were in the minority, and there was a lot who had good technique but not excellent. I think there are still pipers with excellent technique going, but that's only one part of the thing.
Do you think there's an emphasis on that and the instrument? And
there's an emphasis on safe playing, playing by the book, because that's what the judges will want, or that's what the pipers perceive the judges will want and know. And I'm sure that's all happened.
You as a judge and Norman also in the second day, what are you looking for as a judge?
Well, you're looking for technique and bagpipe, of course, but overall you're looking for musicianship.
Yes.
And that is very, very hard to portray in pibroch.
Aye.
And the difference between a really musical interpretation of a tune and a not so musical interpretation of a tune is pretty small. And we talk about these millisecond differences, but these milliseconds mean a huge amount in terms of musicianship. And it's just a question of whether the piper can capture these nuances, which is not easy.
Norman, how would you, if you were instructing a young chap to try and bring out the music, how would you try and describe this to him?
I think the only way we can do that is through, well, loosely canter, but singing, I think is the only way that you can try to impart that. Because I really agree with what Jack says. I mean, the dominance of competition in this area, you know, colours it. It is after all music, and the only value of music is if it can transmit, you know, the emotion of the player into the sensitivity of the audience. It's music's the important thing, but then the fundamentals there have to be there, the instrument and the technique.
Yeah. Duncan, how would you try and bring out the best music in a pibroch when you were on the boards, going round the games?
Well, to try to get the best, you obviously have to have the tunes well memorised, that's to be said, with the bagpipe going, but try to get a bit of song into the thing, be prepared to take some risks, rather than, you know, just be too careful with the thing.
Yeah.
But I say, maybe speaking out of turn, but what I hear too much is too much careful playing, and it's just a bit bland for me, afraid to cut things. And then in the area of cadence,
yes,
where folk play cadences, they're playing the motif of the cadence, but the note prior to it and so on. It seems that if it wasn't for cadences, you wouldn't be able to sometimes delineate phrases. Mm-hmm. And really, if you took away the cadence motif, there should still be the evidence or delineation of phrases. And that, it seems that modern players in particular depend on the motif of a cadence to mark where the cadence
to launch into
or end the cadence,
rather than decorate the phrase.
Well, you know, you could go away and play tunes without this cadence motifs, and you could still play cadence into it, and that just seems to be almost lost.
How do you feel about that, Jack? the cadence?
Yeah, I think it's a crucial part of pibroch.
Yeah.
That's incorporated in, and people have done different things over the years.
Yeah.
And I certainly remember the first time I went for a listen to Bob Brown. We were doing a tune, I think it was the MacLeod's Controversy, and he was singing it over, and I was particularly interested in where he was placing the G grace note on the E of the cadence. And often he wouldn't actually sing it. He would just kind of sing through the E, and I'd say, "Where's the grace note?" And he would say, "Oh, just in the right place," you know. Which actually was very clever, because he just had an intuitive way of doing it. And I think, talking Nichol and Brown, and they both had their music from John MacDonald, but they didn't play like John MacDonald, I'm sure. And Kilberry said that very clearly in one of his letters. None of John MacDonald's pupils actually played anything like John MacDonald. And I think that Nichol and Brown didn't play like each other. And I think that it was Brown who had the charisma, he was able to portray the emotion of the music more effectively, I would have said, than Nichol. Nichol was saying, "This is what I got from John MacDonald, this is what I'll give to you."
Yeah.
But I think that was the difference between them. And that it's the individual putting their own thought and feeling into the tune that really makes it, rather than try to ape what somebody else is doing.
Yeah. Norman?
Yes, I would like to add something to that. It's, you know, probably many people watching this may not know that Nichol and Brown went to John MacDonald for a month, or sometimes 6 weeks, every year between 1926. Nichol went alone in 26. Following year Brown went, until the war. We're talking about 12 years at least, of a month, 6 weeks every year, and during each of these visits they aimed to take 12 tunes each.
My goodness.
And when they came home over the winter, they exchanged these tunes. Now that meant that there were certain tunes that they kind of regarded as their own property, and in which they excelled. And I am not sure that Jack is right to say that you know, that Brown is more, well, certainly more charisma, but whether his playing was any better than Nichol's is questionable. I don't think it's useful to say was one a better player than the other or not. The problem with Nichol was, I think he was a first-class pibroch player, but in 1958 he made a broadcast, and the night before the broadcast he went to Bob Brown's and went through this, and Brown thought, this is going to be out of this world, this broadcast. When he saw him the next morning, he realised something was wrong. The man was ill, you know, quite suddenly, and he made a very, very bad broadcast, really terrible, and his reputation thereafter vanished, you know, kind of vanished off the stage, as it were.
So, what made him ill then?
I don't think there's any doubt that prior to that, Bob Nichol, I think, was quite exceptional, and there'd be a number of tunes in which he would have excelled. Same thing with Bob Brown, of course, but even, I mean, King's Taxes, Unjust Incarceration, Marion's Wailing, Big Spree. You know, I wouldn't want to say was one a better player than the other, but I would want to say that I think Nichol was an exceptionally good player until that problem.
Do you know what the problem was?
I think it was infectious hepatitis.
Okay.
From a liver disease.
Yeah. And did his health recover?
Beg your pardon?
Did his health recover?
Oh yes, it did. Yes, it did, but I don't think his playing ever really recovered, and then he was beset, as many are, by this musician's focal dystonia later in life.
Yeah.
So I don't think really, well, that was much later.
Yeah. You get any comment on that?
The late Norman Meldrum spoke about this and all. He had seen Bob Nichol prior to that broadcast, and you know, at that time the broadcasts were live; they were not recorded, and they were all lugging into the wireless. And when they heard Bob Nichol's broadcasting, I don't remember what tune he described what tune he had played, but it was a shadow of the guy he had heard the day before. So.
We're in Aboyne here, essentially the northeast, and a lot of people in the world, generally speaking, think of Glasgow and the West Highlands, the home of piping, the pibroch, and I'm quite sure any three of you would care to disabuse people about that notion. And what essentially brought good piping and pibroch playing and everything to northeast of Scotland? How does it claim to be important?
I think we started off with Queen Victoria, really.
Could be. Angus Mackay was her piper, of course.
Uh-huh.
And then later on, John MacDougall Gillis, Aberdeen. J.S. McLennan, Aberdeen.
Uh-huh.
Sandy Cameron at Aboyne Castle, he was piper to Lord Aboyne. So long before Nichol and Brown put their own stamp on D-side piping or Aberdeenshire piping or North East piping, there was these people.
There was a heritage here then over a long time.
Yeah.
And the composition?
Well, J.S. McLennan, I suppose.
Composition?
Composition.
Aye, but there's no pibroch composed in this. No, that was more or less West Highland.
I think the furthest east pibroch is within the antiquity to it, I think, is the tune Craigellachie.
Uh-huh.
I think that was the furthest east.
Who made that?
I don't know who it was, but I think Professor Alex Haddo,
Uh-huh.
he did a bit of a study on the locations, and I think Craigellachie is the furthest east. They've got of a tune that's relevant to an area.
Yes.
The Battle of Aldern.
Battle of Aldern, Harlow.
That's right.
Yes. I suppose if you get the books out, you can go further east. You wouldn't essentially arrive at Oslo or Moscow, but you'll get pretty near the East Coast. No, I was just interested, you know, and if you go north of Inverness, you more or less lose the art, don't you? The further north you go, I'm not talking about the West Coast, I'm talking about, you know, up Thurso and all these places, Wick. There's not a lot of piping up there, is there?
No, at one time there would have been more piping up there. There was quite a famous player that Bob Nichol used to speak of quite a bit, Donald Ian Mackenzie from Tang, who was a pupil of the Camerons.
And John MacDonald.
And John MacDonald, of course. But there was a few of them in the north.
Donald McGilvery.
Donald McGilvery and so on.
So we can I dig up one or two.
Well, John Barn Mackenzie, he was, I think, a native of, or Donald Cameron, he was from Strathconnell. John Barn Mackenzie, who was regarded as being the king of Highland Pipers, believed at Cadence Cemetery in Strathpeffer.
Aye.
If you look away back, was Joseph MacDonald who wrote the first treatise on pibroch, not from Scotland? Tongue.
Right, Duncan, while we're talking about piping in the area and the northeast and everything else, I think it'd be quite a nice thing for you to tell me about the various games that you covered in the circuit. In the northeast, the Aboyne games were alluded to a second ago. Tell me about the rest of your wee visits over the years.
Well, the earlier years I was obviously up in the Dingle area, and I would go to like Invergordon, Strathpeffer and Dingle games itself, Nairn and so on, until I came down to Aberdeenshire. And then of course there was Aboyne, Braemar, Ballater, started on what's just termed a monarch gathering, and then we extended out to like a netty bridge and so on. And that's...
Who was your favourite?
I think probably Braemar ended up as something of a pilgrimage.
Aye.
And
How was Braemar different?
well, I think there was some, well, for me there was some magical about coming out to Deeside here, and being breathing in the same kind of air as, dare I say, the two Bobs, because that's what I came here for. And I felt it was something of a privilege to come up this neck of the woods and play at Braemar.
When you played at Braemar, it was a full day.
Yes.
From early morning, and many pibrochs typically would they ask you to submit.
Well, that was difficult. There was an upsurge in piping. I saw a period which there wasn't very many going around with the games, and then in the 70s there was quite an upsurge in numbers, and to control the numbers they had the notion in Deeside, particularly in Aboyne and Braemar, to increase the pibroch requirements. At one stage, Aboyne required 12 pibroch to be submitted. And at about that time, Braemar required 10 pibroch to be submitted.
My goodness.
It was quite a task, you know, and good sense has prevailed a bit, and Aboyne has come back to about the 3, I think it is, and Braemar you require 8 yet.
8
tunes. But
any notice or straight up to the table present?
oh yes,
tunes?
yes. Well, so far as Braemar is concerned, about a fortnight prior to the date, you put in an entry in, you know, so you've got a wee bit of time to go and think about it. But
aye, but when did you get told what tune you were?
oh, just when you met this 3 redoubtable characters at the bench, and they give you poison, you know.
So if they didn't like your face, they'd give you as short as possible tune.
What I would say about and this has maybe been patronising, but it's not. What I would say about what I experienced in Deeside, and I did play elsewhere, you didn't or nobody got anything in the way of prizes because of reputation. You could I've seen folk arriving in Deeside with a string of gold medals behind them, and you could almost say, oh, that's going to be a success largely on reputation, and that reputations on a lot of occasions fell to nothing. They just got their dues for what they played. I had a conversation with Bob Nichol about this, and I remember him saying about this sort of thing. Oh, sometimes prizes don't equate to good playing, you know. So he was quite down to earth in this sort of thing. He just didn't get anything for reputation.
Yes, yes. So, anything else about the games, the other games? Or?
Oh well, not really. Just I think at that time there was quite a bit of camaraderie amongst the pipers. If for example you had some problems with your pipes, they were quite happy to go and give a shot of a big drone reed, or give a shot of your pipes for that matter, you know. And
yes.
That was the days prior to maybe the breathalyzer test. And it was a much more social thing then.
Aye, and it'd be quite adequately sanitised with the odd whisky.
Exactly. Yeah. I enjoyed the North East games, and as I say,
the light music. How many tunes did you put in for the light music?
Well, Aboyne, that was initially there was six of each.
6 marches, Spies and Mules.
And when I came here for a start, D.R. McLennan and George Stoddart, they would be attending Aboyne, you know. They were the judges at the time, you know.
Yes.
And the first time I met D.R. McLennan up here, he said, "What are you doing here?" He knew my uncle Hugh. He had met my uncle Hugh in Singapore, and when he found out I was a Watson, which I don't know if it made any difference to the prizes, but it was kind of small world kind of thing.
That's fine. Now, leading on nicely from that, I think Norman's going to tell us about the Masters of Pibroch series. Now, could you describe what that is in the first instance and how it evolved and came about, etc.?
Yes, well, if we start at the beginning, sometime in the early 1970s, after which I'd been going back and forth to Nichol for more than 20 years, I suppose, I suggested to him that it might be a good idea to record his teaching, his singing teaching. I know, I said, that's a good idea. So there was no plan to disseminate it in any way. We just had an idea to preserve it. And I got the best piece of course, reel-to-reel was the only thing, best equipment I could, which was a UAR, which was the same thing the BBC used for outside broadcast. And we started, and what happened is that we just had the Pipers'Persuasion Society books and went through them, page out, tune after tune after tune, recording his teaching. And then when you come to a tune that he hadn't got from John MacDonald, well, my intent was preserving John MacDonald's teaching. He would say, "Oh, I didn't get this from Johnny, but this is the way I would play it." Well, fair enough. It was recorded, and then that took 4 years. It started in 1972, and I think I was up pretty near every week. And of course, it took hours at night. I was getting home late at night.
Aye.
And yes, it was for books 1 to book 12. And this vast amount of material was, people perceived it as being valuable. And, the people societies of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa got to hear of it, wanted copies. Fortunately, Bob Brown had been on teaching trips to these places, and I said, yes, you're welcome to have copies, but in exchange, could I have copies of what you have, Brown? Because Brown did a lot of playing in these now. I had none playing, you see, of Nichol. Brown had a lot of playing at recitals and so on. So these reels came to me and my reels went to them. And then I got a lot of material from Malcolm McRae, who gave me, he'd recorded almost all his lessons from Bob Brown.
My goodness, that's
And then
terrific.
there were, of course, in the background were the Lagan tapes that Bob Brown had made for Dr. Mackay Lagan back in the sort of mid-50s. Or anyway, I mean, aside from these Lagan tapes, I ended up with about 80 hours of recorded material. Very valuable stuff.
Yes.
But I was sitting at a dinner at the Glasgow Highland Club, invited by Joe Henderson, next to Rob Wallace, and mentioned that I'd got this stuff recorded from Nichol. And oh, he says, but this needs to be put onto a digital format to preserve it. So we applied and got a grant from the Scottish Arts Council, and it was all put onto digital tapes. It was sometime after that the notion came, really would it be worth publishing it? I don't remember whether that came from Rob Wallace or me, but anyway, we decided we would try and publish it. And it ended up a series of 10 instructional CDs. I had the whole thing very carefully edited, not edited, catalogued.
Yes.
At the quality, 8 different tunes, whether there was any mistakes and so on. And we would compile a cassette tape of probable contact, and then we spent a day in a sound studio in Glasgow, a first-class sound engineer, Rob Wallace and myself, and these were wonderful days. I mean, absolutely fascinating, apart from the crack and all that, but fascinating to edit this stuff, you see. And again, fortunately, Ian Green was persuaded to take it on. That's how
The green tracks, yes.
He thought this is not going to make any money at all, but I mean, maybe it's a service I should do, you see.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's made quite a large amount of money out of it. As far as we were concerned, it was I wouldn't possibly take any money. Bob Nichol would never have dreamt of charging any money tuition, and I could take money from that. That was non-profit making, but you see, it sold so well after the first volume came out in 1997. I got fantastic reviews, and then we put out 10 volumes altogether, and each of these would be covering maybe 7 or 8 tunes. And they really sold all over the world.
So it's 70 or 80 tunes you have?
Yeah. Sold all, and the last one, the volume 10 came out 2008, but they continue to sell.
Excellent. That's a
So,
first class.
and I think, I mean, it really is rather a valuable resource, because it does preserve, essentially, the teaching of John MacDonald.
Okay.
Say,
Which it really takes us back to the essence that's been touched on very briefly during this conversation today, is competitive playing and playing merely for enjoyment. And have we lost some of the music through competition, restrictions of competition, rather than merely putting the pipes on the shoulder and expressing a tune?
Undoubtedly. I was in conversation.
Maybe you'd like to say something about that, Norman.
I'm sure that's the case. I'm
Yep.
sure that's the case. And yet, you know, nowadays there's so many people playing pibroch worldwide. How many people would be playing pibroch without the stimulus of
Yes, I know.
competition?
Aye.
Very few.
The competition certainly brings up the
yes,
standard.
and the prestige that there is
Yeah.
of winning these major awards.
Yes.
That certainly colours it. Of course, if you didn't have that, the whole thing would be much purer. But would anybody be playing it?
Well,
Or how many?
aye.
That's the irony.
So, and what's the Pibroch Society's views?
Yeah, I mean, I think competition's with us. As I say, it's the irony. I think you know, if you said when did pibroch start to become more formalised and perhaps less spontaneous, you would say it was the start of the first competitions, way back in 1781.
Yes.
But without competition, maybe it wouldn't be played at all.
Yes.
So I don't know. Where does Pibroch Society come in? They came in really at a time when pibroch again was thought to be at danger of becoming extinct.
Yes.
And they got together all the available manuscripts and they published a series of books.
Yeah.
And they have been criticised over the last 20 years quite severely for inaccuracies in transcription, for being the only thing that people will refer to. And it was really through that, that made me decide to come into the Pibroch Society, really, because there was this thought out there that everything that Pibroch Society had done was of no value, which really came from a book written by a good friend of mine, Willie Donaldson, who was also at Aberdeen University. He was a pipe major of the C pipe band, and Willie wrote a book called Highland Pipe and Scottish Society, in which he really laid at the door of the Pipers'Persuasion Society the degeneration of pibroch as he had seen it. And I just said to myself, well, you know, that maybe isn't right. I want to see if that's true or not. And so I thought, well, I'll join the Pipers'Persuasion Society and just see what's happening. When I joined, it was quite remote to me. It was quite remote to many pipers, I think, at that time. But I'd like to think that it's becoming less remote, more accessible, and that it's doing something now maybe to publicise pibroch in a more open way. And I think I'm pretty certain that that's actually what's happening. There's a much greater openness about pibroch and how it should be interpreted now than there was.
So there's much more fruitful discussion in your view about where pibroch's going, where it's been, and
I think so.
where it's likely to go in the future.
I think so, yeah.
And is it quite a healthy membership?
Yes, very. I mean, we're fortunate now to have 550 members, whereas when I came in it was probably about 200.
Aye.
And of course it started off life just as a little gentleman's club.
Yes.
And its whole ethos has changed greatly. We've made, well, all the original sources are now available, the manuscript sources are now available. And they do often contain musical nuances that aren't contained in the Pipers'Persuasion Society scores.
Yes.
And I think I would love it if people were able to try and go back to these, and they can do it, but competition certifies what judges know, affects what players will play, and that process doesn't really seem to be happening.
So how educated are the judges? I know that you were at the conference there a couple of days ago. What steps do you take about seeing the standard, if you wish, of the judges? What's the approach there?
The Pipers'Persuasion Society has run judges seminars for the last 20 years, 25 years, twice a year, and latterly they've concentrated on the set tunes, and really each judge will come along and will hear a presentation about one of the set tunes from one of his colleagues, and that's been a really great stimulus for folk learning and being aware of pibroch, and it's been a good way of hopefully keeping judges up to speed.
So, and the judges are therefore expected to take a broader view of what's been placed before them by the competitor,
I think
because of a wider aspect on each of the tunes.
And I think they will. I think the days of, you know, if a piper starts the tune playing down to low G, for example, the bells of Bertie, to bro bro, and if the judge wasn't taught that, he would have put them out. That these days have passed now.
Okay. And do you expect the senior competitor to come up and maybe tell you what style he's learned this tune, or just merely to go up and play it?
I think most times they'll go up and play it. Everybody has their favourite tunes.
Yeah.
And most times people will still play pretty well according to the score.
Okay.
There are occasional people who will say, I'm going to play the style written by Donald MacDonald, or I'm going to play this version or that version. But it's very much the exception.
Would you more or less take that as a mannerly aspect rather than a necessary aspect of the competitor's performance?
I don't quite know what you mean.
Well, they'd come up and just good manners and tell you where he's come from before he starts the tune.
Oh yes, it would be good manners, and it would be essential to the judge. If he's playing something that's a less well-known score, he would bring the score to the judge.
Okay. You were going to say something about that?
Yes, well I wanted to touch on 2 points. The one is the Jack's mention of the criticism that was made against the early luminaries of the Pibroch Society who produced these books, and particularly by Donaldson, whom you've mentioned. But without people like Kilberry and Sheriff Grant, you know, the enormous amount of work, and Archie Kenneth, I suppose, in transliteration from Cantor, so the actual publication of the, where would it be, you know? there are not many people competent to do that. It's a very, very valuable resource. Of course, it's not perfect, but I don't think it's right to criticise.
There's nothing that's perfect in the world, really, is there?
The other thing is rigidity. Maybe it's worth telling a story of Bob Nichol. I was judging with him at Aberdeen. I can't remember, it was sometime in the 1970s. He, on the competitor's first bar, he put his pencil nah. He said, he has not got it. You see, if it wasn't exactly as John MacDonald did, no. Now, that, I think, has disappeared. Maybe not entirely, but it must disappear. You know, it's no use. John MacDonald's musical interpretation may be very fine, but every musician's at liberty to put his own spirit into the thing. But I certainly have seen a lot of rigidity in judging, and I think still a bit of it there.
Pibroch's well served in the northeast.
Oh, there's a lack of teaching up here. The teaching in general in the northeast has been overlooked, dare I say. In other regions, for example the Highland region, they employed school teachers and so on around the schools. To name but a few, there was like a John McDougall, Ian McFadden,
Yes.
and John Burgess and people like that. And in the northeast there was no facility like that at all, and I think we've missed out quite a bit because of the lack of teaching. And another aspect which is I find strange, and I've said this a few times, the two Bobs were local to the area, but very few locals took advantage of them being here. Most of their pupils came from out with the area, like Donald Morris from South Uist, Jack Taylor from St Andrews. The only one I can think of that made any real impact is John McDougall.
Norman Melton.
Norman Melville, he's from Forfar, you know.
I remember even Patrick Mullard came across from Brittany.
That's right,
You know.
Malcolm from Australia, and of course
Jackie Pouncey as well,
the same thing happened at home, strangely enough, with this Cameron family.
Yeah.
They were from Maryborough, and I understand that John MacDonald went to Seafield Cottage quite a bit in Maryborough. There was a family of Chisholms there, and they could, the old man Chisholm spoke of various folk arriving at the Seafield Cottage, but very few, if any, locals ever went near the Camerons. So it seemed to die out there. Whether it's because a prophet in his own country gets no recognition, I don't know, but certainly in Aberdeenshire there's virtually no locals, or very few locals took advantage of the two Bobs, and going back the generations, very few locals took any
Well, I can't finish this depressing, no, I really can't. Jack!
Well, I can give you some.
Okay, let's go.
On my left is a man who teaches puberty pupils, and on my right also. So there's a concentration of puberty teachers right here.
Well, we're doing our best, I suppose.
Well, that's what I love, and I'm just going to draw a veil over the whole thing because the sun's going down over the hills there. It's starting to get dark, and all these technicians amongst the watchers say, "Oh, that somebody's not got any lighting, and we can't hear it because it's not got microphones." So I hope you all enjoyed it today. I know that I did, and I found it very informative, and I thank you very much, three wise men here. Very, very kindly once again, and many thanks from Pipers'Persuasion. Thank you.
Thank you.